Well, welcome everyone. Sorry for the slight delay in getting started, but hey, it's the technical world that we live in these days. We're so excited to kick off our fall Inside 2020 event series with you. I'm Karen Mathis, President and General Manager of KUOW, Puget Sound Public Radio. The Inside 2020 series was created to offer an insider's look into the world of KUOW and NPR journalists during an election year. This fall, we have an exciting lineup of virtual conversations with NPR's leading political correspondents. Here and Now's Tonya Mosley today, followed by Audie Cornish later this month, and then Ozma Holland and Mara Liasson. You can RSVP to all of these events for free at kuow.org/events. As we kicked off our planning for the 2020 election late last year, we anticipated it would be the biggest story of 2020. But here we are today in the midst of a pandemic, global protests for racial justice, a presidential election unlike any we've ever encountered, and oh yes, by the way, firestorms, wildfires ravaging the West. Keeping up with the news right now is difficult. And as these journalists will share, reporting is tough. The news is unsettling, the pace is exhausting, and as we strive together to make sense of it all, misinformation challenges the very notion of truth. KUOW and NPR work in service of your right to know. We are here to guide you through this challenging time, empowering you with knowledge, fact-checked reporting, and a multitude of perspectives. Today, we have two journalists who are working to bring you the facts and broaden your perspective every day. Tonya Mosley, co-host of Here and Now from NPR and WBUR Boston, and Liz Jones, editor at KUOW. Tonya Mosley has worked at news outlets across the country, including KQED, Al Jazeera America, WBUR, and KUOW. She has won national awards for her work, most recently an Emmy Award in 2016 for her televised piece Beyond Ferguson, and an Edward R. Murrow Award for her public radio series Black in Seattle. Currently, in addition to her work at Here and Now, she co-hosts the podcast Truth Be Told. Liz Jones has been a journalist at KUOW for over a decade. Before becoming an editor, she reported on issues within our region's growing immigrant and refugee populations, as well as stories connected to minority groups with a longer history in the area. In addition to KUOW's airwaves, her work has been heard on NPR's Morning Edition and All Things Considered, Here and Now, Latino USA, Marketplace, The Takeaway, and the BBC. Thank you again so much for being here. And thank you to our KUOW members who make this work possible. And Liz, now I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Karen. So nice to see you there. Tonya Mosley, we are so happy to have you here today. Do we have you there on the screen?
Yes, I'm here.
There you are.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Yes, great to have you. And just a little housekeeping quickly for our virtual audience out there. We want to hear from you during this conversation. You can share your questions with us in the comment section. We'll be monitoring those throughout our discussion, and we'll try to include as many as we can. So start typing away on those questions that you have for Tonya Mosley. Here we are, Tanya, meeting on Zoom in early September. Months ago, perhaps we would have had this meeting in person on a stage in an event venue somewhere, perhaps in Seattle or Los Angeles, where you are. But we're here on the screens sharing this time. Just wanted to ask you quickly, where are you joining us from today?
So I'm right outside of LA in South Pasadena. And as you heard from Karen, and as folks know, the entire West is dealing with multiple wildfires. And I'm about 5 miles away from a wildfire burning that's 0% contained. We're in the warning zone to evacuate if we need to. And so it's a really trying time because there are so many stories that I think in the past, any one of the stories that we are covering deeply would have been major events that we would have focused all of our attention to. But now we're focusing our attention on all of them. And there's still the same expectation that we provide the comprehensive coverage that we are known to do. And so it's a challenge that I really take on and am honored to take on, with the operative word being challenge. Major challenge, yeah.
Yes, major challenge. We should have knocked on wood back in the day when we had the pandemic started, we had the economy, we had the
Mm.
protests going, and I think somebody in a news meeting said, all we need now is an earthquake.
Oh my
Um,
gosh. Yeah. And someone
Sadly, we've
joked,
got these wildfires
yeah,
now.
someone also mentioned earthquakes, because we are, I actually live along a fault line, and it's due for an earthquake. We just have to be prepared for all of those things. I shouldn't have put that
Well,
out in the universe, by the way, Liz. We
we shouldn't
let's not have that
let's get
happen.
that, knock on that wood. Well, we are going to talk about several things today, including our election system, voting system, voter access, a lot of concerns coming up around there. We'll touch on the pandemic, on the protests for racial justice we've seen throughout the summer and how those may play out into the fall. We'll talk about journalism in this
Mhm.
time during COVID-19, and I want to hear what's on your mind and what you're talking about in your newsroom about prioritizing news coverage. So we'll get to all those things in that discussion. So as you're thinking of the questions for our audience out there, keep that in mind. And Tanya, when we spoke the other day, you mentioned you just crossed your 1-year anniversary as a host for Here and Now.
Yes.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Wonderful to hear you on the national airwaves. Just wanted to hear how this year has been for you. How's the transition been?
Oh, what a year. It's been amazing to have a platform as a host. Um, as I mentioned, though, all of these stories, I mean, wow, talk about just throwing me in the fire. We had the impeachment hearings. We had then COVID-19, then the racial reckoning and protests, now the presidential election and wildfires. And so if there was ever a time to just get in the thick of it and do it, that's what I'm doing right now. And it's been an honor to host the show.
Yeah, so you've certainly been through it, and throw anything at you now, right?
I know, right? I can do anything. I can literally do anything, I feel like. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the election. We are, less than 8 weeks away
Mhm,
from voting day, and this will be a voting day like none other. Multiple voting days, multiple ways of voting,
mhm,
so many factors leading into this election. Um, I know for you, you mentioned you're particularly focused on issues around the voting system and voting rights
mhm.
in these weeks ahead. Talk us through a little bit what you're watching on that front and kind of what you've got your eye on in the run up to November.
Sure. I'm very interested in deepening our coverage of voting integrity. I mean, we have so much that's happening right now with the pandemic, the access to voting, um, the legal challenges around different states and the ability for certain people to vote. I'm thinking about in Florida with felons being able to vote, but having to pay their fines first. And all of the efforts around making certain that happens for people. Absentee voting, 34 states actually now allow for absentee voting. But what will that look like? Every state has different rules on what postmark dates need to be in place. When is the last day that you can actually drop off your ballot, which is the postmark date. But then every state also has to allow for in-person voting, even if they have an absentee vote system. And so what will those in-person voting places look like? What are the changes in place with COVID-19? Are people trained who are poll workers, who are often volunteers who give up their time? This is actually an amazing time for local news. It's an amazing challenge because local news has the power to be able to give folks that information in real time and be a resource for people. And as a national show, I think about how I can offer context and clarity so that people can know, based on where they live, what's happening around the world around them, and how they play into to this whole storyline. I'm also thinking so much about context. I think I talked with you about how in 2013, the Supreme Court struck down a provision in the Voting Rights Act, which essentially allowed for the monitoring of some places where they had found that there was racial discrimination around voting. And that will play into this election in the few weeks that we have in a significant way. And I want to know how those areas are tackling some of the issues that they've had in the past, and without there being oversight, what it looks like. So there's so much there, but I believe that our role at Here and Now, and my role in particular, will be to offer context and understanding and clarity.
Yeah, so many questions to figure out as our voting systems change and states are really scrambling to figure out statewide voting. And this is a historic, shift in how we do things, and that doesn't stop at our elections, clearly. Um, I was reading an article earlier with Kim Wyman, who's our secretary or our head of elections here, Republican head of elections. And Washington is one of the 5 states that does all mail-in voting and has for, I think, almost 10 years now. I think 2011 was when we switched over. And she said it took a good 5 years. Like, it was after a really close election here, and recounts, and a lot of counties clearly wanted to shift to all mail-in voting, but it took a long time. It's not something you can turn the switch overnight and make that
That's right.
happen.
I lived
And
there during that time. I
oh,
lived in
right.
Seattle, Washington during that time. And I've been thinking about that in the context of the country, because Washingtonians are now used to waiting a few days before getting official election results, unless it's just someone wins out of the water, a particular measure. It's, the percentage points are so much higher, then you can kind of call it. But the rest of the country, we're not used to that when it comes to a presidential election, that it could be a few days, a week, a few weeks, a few months. I mean, this is going to completely change the way we view our election system. And I just don't know. I just don't know what that will look like. I think none of us do, but it's something to consider. The fact that, it took 5 years for the state of Washington to really have a clear system in place. And there are states that are just putting it together right now as we speak.
Yeah, and I agree with you there about keeping listeners informed in the best way, or keeping our audience both on digital, on the broadcast, keeping people informed about how to vote, where to vote, when to vote, the rules that are changing around them,
Mhm.
issues coming up with access. This reminds me of a story I did long ago on people that were doing the phone calling, like
Oh,
calling
yeah.
for,
Mhm.
candidates, I forget, phone banking, I guess,
Mhm.
ahead of the election, and just calling voters who'd already pledged, to vote for a certain candidate, and just reminding them, remember the election day, you have to be postmarked by this day. And it was really eye-opening how people didn't know what day to vote, didn't know where to
Mm.
go, didn't know the postmark, just like maybe we're not as plugged in as I had expected, people who had already said, I'm going to vote.
Mhm.
So just, I think in our position as journalists, being able to get that word out in the clearest, most, the easiest way for people to access and understand how to make sure that their vote is counted.
Mhm.
And you mentioned the lawsuits the other day when we were talking too. Um, Anything
Yeah.
more on the legal front that you're watching and consider really important to keep an eye on heading into
Sure.
November?
Well, there are the legal fights, the USPS challenges. I think there's something like 20 states have now sued USPS over the changes that have been made. And, you know, I really want to provide clarity for people in the best way that I can on my platforms about where USPS sits in all of this, and then how Secretary of States or elections commissions then play a part in working with USPS. And then what our roles are in making certain that we have the information on, perhaps sometimes it means alternate ways of doing things. There are lots of campaigns that are out there now. For instance, basketball star LeBron James has created a nonprofit that it is not just like in name and they do a few things. There's a coordinated effort across the country to get people to not only request absentee ballots, but then drive their ballots to the Secretary of State or Elections Commission's offices, or polling places. So there's lots of that's happening. And I just want to be able to, the best way that I can, provide that clarity, because there's so many legal battles that are happening leading up to the election. And I think there'll be lots of legal battles after the election too. And
I
so
think, yeah.
and so as a journalist, really gathering all of the folks who are equipped to have this conversation and are very steeped in constitutional law and those types of things to provide clarity for our audience.
Yeah, well, I think you're right to have your eye on that leading up. We did get a question from Leanne in Tacoma. She asks, what is NPR's plan for preparing audiences prior to the election and on election night itself for the fact that it will likely be days or weeks before the presidential winner is known? Have
Mhm.
you guys talked about that?
You know, we've talked about it in meetings with my team at Here and Now, and how we will staff up and how we will respond to some of those possibilities. I think that speaks to what we were just talking about earlier, making certain that we are equipped to give people a clear understanding of the process as it happens. But yes, I mean, we um, we're along for the ride just like our audience members, but our roles are to be able to give them a sense of what's happening when it's happening and offering context.
Yeah, and clearly one of the wrinkles and all that is that we are in the midst of a pandemic,
Mhm,
and reporting has changed so much during this time. The way that we're able to be out in our communities, out in the world, have our eyes and ears on the ground. Um, Kind of pivoting a bit from election for a moment, it just made me think about, how you've
I
adapted.
do have some, I'm so sorry, before you answer
No,
that
go
question, I
ahead.
do want to say something else to the woman who sent us the question from Tacoma. You know, NPR is a news organization that is very careful in making certain that we have it right before we put it out on air. And that's really important, and it will be vitally important during this moment, because the last thing we want to do is call an election before the full results are in. And so I think that is the paramount priority for NPR, is making certain that we have it right and that we don't have to walk back a prediction. News media is notorious for wanting to be the first. All of the networks want to be the first to be able to call it. But this is such a consequential and an important election. Every single one is, but this one in particular, because of all of the pieces of the puzzle that we just talked about, um, that yes, it may be days or weeks or months, and we have to make certain that we give people the right information.
Yes, and those days will be so critical and so unprecedented. I've, seen one thing that a lot of journalists are watching is the messaging that will come out immediately in the aftermath of the election, of what we'll be hearing from the different candidates, what we'll hear from Biden, from Trump, from different campaigns about how they're reading the results and
Mhm,
how they're messaging the results. So that will be something, like you mentioned, we've gotten used to in Washington a little bit with the all mail-in voting. We've Election night changed for us years ago, and we don't get all the results on election night. We
mhm.
wait days, sometimes weeks, for that information to come in and to be able to call a race. So I guess we'll all be in that boat together. Wanted to share another question from a listener, an audience member. How do you report on significant issues when Trump keeps driving his own narrative? So maybe thinking about election issues and how to keep reporting on the issues as well as what the president is doing and saying.
It's a challenge. In 2016, after Trump was elected, I think uh, newsrooms across the country sat down and looked at how our coverage fared, and were we fair? Were we accurate? What does fairness mean? What does objectivity mean? These are questions that we grappled in 2016. And 3.5, almost 4 years later, we're still having those discussions. You know, from my vantage point, it's really important, and I think it's the vantage point of most journalists, is that we can't fall into false equivalency. We can't be reactive all the time, because President Trump does take up a lot of airspace. And if we were to jump on every single thing, it's a challenge because he is our president. But if we jump on every single thing, I mean, our entire program would always be about Trump. And so when it comes to this particular election, making certain that we don't make former Vice President Joe Biden be in the position of being reactionary to President Trump is really important, because it's our roles to be able to show the totality of both of these campaigns. And so we have to ask ourselves. We actually had a discussion last week, and it involved Biden and Trump both visited Kenosha, Wisconsin. When Trump visited Kenosha, we covered it. We talked about the things he said. A few days later, Biden went to Wisconsin. And in crafting the scripts, it was clear that, oh my gosh, what we were doing was making Biden reactionary to Trump. It was, what did he say in response to what Trump said a few days ago versus what were the things that he did when he was in Wisconsin? What were the talking points that Biden had when he was there? Who did he talk to? What were his messages? And so that's just a very small example of the way that you have to slow down and think about how you're placing these candidates, because we did it in 2016. If you look at the amount of coverage that Trump got, which was a huge, significant amount in relation to Hillary Clinton, a big part of it was we put Hillary Clinton in the position of always reacting to President Trump. And in that way, it was coverage that benefited Trump. And we have to think about how we can even the playing field and what we're offering our listeners.
Yes, so important to think about the framing. And you mentioned slowing down and thinking about the kind of totality of how you're framing and the context you're putting into a story. It makes me think a little bit about our coverage of the racial justice protests this summer. And, we were in the thick of it here in Seattle for many months. You've been in the thick of it in Los Angeles. And this is not just many months. This is an ongoing multi-year struggle for racial justice and protests in the street over police violence. And thinking about the issues of how we keep the issues in front of the narrative or balance, how we report on issues and narrative. I was interested to see a Pew Research Institute survey recently. They surveyed voters in August and showed their top issues as the economy, healthcare, and Supreme Court appointments. This was in August. And what I found surprising, one of the issues, well, maybe not surprising, but just it stood out to me, was one of the issues where Trump and Biden were the furthest apart was on the importance of race and ethnic inequality. 76% of Biden supporters saw it as very important, compared to 24% of Trump supporters. So I was curious to ask you how you're seeing this summer of protests and civil unrest influencing the election, or even just influencing the election narrative.
It's an interesting question. It's an interesting survey by Pew, which I respect and I trust. I would love to know the anatomy of that survey, just to know who they surveyed, what parts of the country they surveyed, and all of those things. Well, it plays a huge role in that our president is using it to stoke fear and discord among Americans on what is the most divisive topic in American history. I mean, we have a problem with race and racism in this country. That's just a fact. And why June in particular felt so cathartic, but also so unbelievably painful was because it was a culmination of so much that we haven't dealt with. The thing about it, if any of us have ever gone through that kind of pain just on a personal level, we know it feels really good afterwards to just kind of move on from it. And so I'm not surprised that this Pew Research study has found that people are not really thinking about this when we go into the election. And President Trump is speaking to his base when he is sowing racial discord, really pitting the suburbs against the cities. That is a racial assertion, because we know the folks that when we're talking about the suburbs versus the cities, what we're saying. He said a lot of other things. And so that does not surprise me that there would be this stark difference in Trump supporters versus Biden supporters and them viewing this topic. And I'm seeing it being used in a way that fuels that division.
Right.
We all are.
Yeah. And part of it seems to be President Trump wanting to steer his narrative and messaging more toward the law and order as you mentioned, and away from the handling of the pandemic. That's certainly been something in terms of how we see him speaking and where he's spending his time speaking. Any thoughts on how you see the pandemic playing into voter opinion or votes, I guess, this election, or how you see it influencing the election? Clearly it is with our whole election system up in the air, but I guess in terms of priorities for voters, or I'm surprised that hasn't been a higher or polled as a higher issue for voters.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this. As a journalist, it will be interesting to see how this will play out, because there's so many people who are suffering, so many people who are unemployed, people who have lost loved ones, who have died from COVID-19. There's just a lot of suffering in the world, and we're learning a lot about perhaps the things that Trump could have done earlier to stop the amount of devastation that we're seeing. I don't know how much that will play out in this election, because I think that for many people, it further solidified their thoughts about President Trump and his ability to lead. And for those who are staunch supporters, which we've had quite a few on the show, they feel that he's done an excellent job, and that perhaps it's been overblown. And that goes into something else that I'm very, very concerned about, and it's the role of social media and its impact on our democracy. And it's something we don't talk about often enough, because it's so big that we can't even wrap our heads around it. But when we think about how social media plays into the conspiracy theories that we're hearing, and people really grabbing onto those conspiracy theories as truths, what we're fighting against are multiple media streams, and we're just one of those streams as public radio people. We're kind of like off on the side, and social media is the place that drives information. I don't know the answer to it, but I think that is a big concern for me, Liz, is that I don't know how much more we can sustain this kind of division that has been fueled by social media.
Yeah, that's something I'm certainly reminded of every time I leave Seattle, is the diversity of opinions and perspectives on the pandemic. And this might happen even neighborhood to neighborhood. You'll go places where people are wearing masks more or less. I was kind of shocked, just a little aside here. I was at the Safeway 2 blocks from my house, and I live right in the middle, right in the center of Seattle. 2 blocks from my house at the Safeway, and there were 3 people in there not wearing masks, one an older gentleman and 2 younger man and woman not wearing masks, and the store clerk asked them to put on their masks, and they just kind of ignored him and continued walking. I was behind them at the checkout, and the young woman turned around and coughed at me, like physically, like intentionally coughed at me. And it really just drove home that sense of we're so many different minds on this, and we are not driven, just like different thoughts about priorities and protecting each other, and kind of are we in this for one or for the whole society here, or just different views depending on who you are and where you're from.
This is the United States of America, and that's the thing about our country, is that we're free to do and to speak in whatever way we want. But one thing that is different now in the age of social media is that there's not a unifying collective voice of understanding of what we deem to be truth. And we've never been in this position before, where we are questioning what is actual truth. If you set forth facts based on the journalism tenets that we learned on how to gather truthful information, and you pit that against all of the other conspiracy theories, pieces of fiction that have been produced online, and people don't have a way to measure what is true that you put forth, or what they're hearing other places or reading other places, how can there be a unifying collective idea of what we want for the country, for the future of this country.
Right, that unifying truth, unifying trust, certainly seeing erosion there in a lot of ways. Wanted to remind the audience that we are taking your questions. If you'd like to leave
I
a
can't
question
hear
or,
you anymore for some, oh, there you are. Okay, I can hear you
oh,
now.
can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Just wanted to remind the audience that we are taking questions. If you'd like to leave a question or comment in our chat messaging area, please do. We have one from Mike on YouTube. The question is, what do you think the responsibility of the media is to not, quote, declare a winner on election night, given the fact that so many ballots are likely to come in after November 3rd?
Mm-hmm.
I know you spoke to that a little bit, but yeah, anything more to say on that?
Yeah, we touched on that. We have to have a system in place. And I think, you know, part of our jobs in reporting over the next few weeks is to bring clarity to how these systems work in different states. So we can kind of have a little bit of an understanding of when we should receive results from different states. And based on that, where the problems lie. And based on that, when we can truly call a winner. But I think we all are under the understanding that that will likely not be a possibility on election night to call a winner for this presidential election.
Yes, the waiting game will go on. Just to follow up on that, and I don't know if you can answer this, but Bruce on YouTube asked, what will NPR's policy be for declaring a winner?
Yeah, these are
Not sure.
really great questions. And I actually wish I had talked with the head of the politics team earlier today to get a true sense of what those rules are. But I know that those rules are being put in place. We've had multiple discussions and multiple emails on guidance on how we should go about even the day-to-day as we work closer to the election, to election night. As I was mentioning before, I mean, NPR really sides on the air of caution when it comes to delivering information because they want to make certain that they have the right information before it goes out to the public. So you can be trustful that there won't be a declaring of a winner until there is absolute certainty.
I do have trust in that as well. One more question from Anne on YouTube. And this is something we've heard from a lot of our audience, a lot of our listeners. How do you decide what is and is not newsworthy in this nonstop news cycle? And I'd be curious to hear, you know, how you and the team at Here and Now kind of decides on reporting priorities, story priorities, and how you do that in the context of the larger world of NPR.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's a great question because, you know, I've worked at multiple news organizations over the course of the last 20 or so years. And what always happens and has to happen is a coming together of all of the different editors, reporters, producers, and hosts talking about the news of the day, everyone looking at different forms of news media and coming back with what's happening in their own communities to truly come up with what are the urgent topics to take on a show on any particular day. I think we talked about earlier how news out of the White House really does happen at such a fast-paced speed. So we always find ourselves really in the middle of the day. We are the ones that provide that the latest when it comes to that. President Trump usually has news conferences on our watch or an hour or so before, or it might be happening right after us, and we will carry that. So we will either carry, if we know what the topic is about, or we will report on it and have context through an NPR reporter. But every day we're kind of grappling with the stories of the day and talking through them. And you know, Liz, diversity is such an important topic and issue for me, diversity in newsrooms. It's why it's important to have diversity in newsrooms, because when there are different people coming to the table, you get a clearer sense of what's happening in the world and a clearer sense of the world we live in.
Yeah, and that was something I mentioned this a little bit of the limitations we have during the pandemic and during the coronavirus, limitations of seeing the world around us and bringing that diversity in. I hear you on the diversity of our newsroom is something that we continue to work on. but even bringing in the diverse voices of our community, of the people that we're living around and with and hearing from. That has been something we've talked about in our newsroom so much, about balancing, you know, the value of being out in the world, and if the story value, if the value of the story is worth the risk of going out and physically reporting on a story versus doing something over the phone or from your desk. Those have been really tough conversations, and you just don't know what you're missing when you're not out there. We rely so much on reporters to be our eyes and ears out in the world. And I often make the joke, like, I've never had a brilliant story idea sitting at my desk. It's happens outside talking to people. So this is, you know, a challenge in that way of how we pivot and try to bring in those voices,
A
and
big part of,
prioritize.
yeah,
Yeah.
you know, a big part of that though is re-examining what we do and why we do it. And ultimately, we may come up with the same answers on why we do things a certain way, but we might also find in the interrogation of what we do as journalists a new way. We're all dealing in this pandemic. We all are experiencing exactly what you said, but we still have the mission of providing the most comprehensive coverage that we can provide. And so what does it look like? Maybe what it looks like is mailing kits to people who then can tell us their stories in their own words. And we bring that back and we're able to share that with the public. Maybe it means taking the steps, knowing that it's safe to be outside, and then reporting outside and making certain that we can do it that way. I just think that there are ways that we can use even social tools, as much as I was talking about social media before, using social tools as a means of connection with our audience. I'm just really big on interrogating that, because so much of the division online also is because there's been an erosion of trust between the public and the media. And I still don't think we have really grappled with that erosion of trust by really listening to what our audiences are saying about why they feel like they're more into a conspiracy theory than a deeply reported story on NPR, for instance.
It's encouraging to hear you express how you're able to think in kind of this broader way about the future of journalism when we're living through this monumental journalism moment of the many, many stories, but able to keep in mind, like, we do have to change how we do some things. We do have to be creative. And I think that's what you know, a silver lining of this time is the creativity of finding workarounds for things, maybe finding a future way of doing things, or re-examining, like, we have a project in the wings here. We joke about the future of everything, like everything potentially can change, from schooling to policing to karaoke, of all things. You know, are we all going to share a mic anymore? But I did want to ask you, since you have thought about this quite a bit, I know you did a project at Stanford during your fellowship there, thinking about how we look at racial bias in journalism. And I wanted to ask you to share a little bit just about that project and kind of the relevance for that in this moment as we are reporting on protests heading into the election.
Sure. So I was a John S. Knight Fellow at Stanford University in 2015 and 2016. So it was just that full calendar year. And I worked with another fellow, Janae Desmond Harris, who is now at the New York Times, to put together a toolkit on how to cover race and racism in the United States. And we worked with social scientists at Stanford University to really understand how we're impacted by implicit bias. And we thought, like, maybe this was a way to be able to bring this subject to the forefront of journalists, because both of us had been joking to each other at the early part of the fellowship that, you know, it's amazing. We can be in newsrooms and we have these brilliant journalists who can take on any topic at the drop of a hat. You know, they can take on something about, you know, oceanography or aviation, something that fields of study that they've not studied. But when you talk to them about covering something like racism, all of a sudden, even the best journalists freeze up and they don't know what to do. And they always look to the person of color in the room. And Janae and I, as people of color, we've experienced that over and over. So we wanted to put a toolkit in the hands of journalists so that white journalists could also cover these issues, because white is also a race. And white people are just as much a part of this equation as those who are marginalized or disenfranchised or experiencing direct racism. So we worked on that toolkit and we presented it to several newsrooms. And it's interesting, we still have newsrooms who contact us to this day. This week I received 2 emails asking, are we still doing this workshop? Unfortunately, we are not, because we both have full-time jobs. But this racial reckoning that we're having in our country, it really shows us the importance of it. When everything went down with George Floyd's death in late May and early June, the protests started, it was very clear that many newsrooms were not equipped to handle it, to handle the unrest all across the country in big and small cities and towns. It's still something we have to deal with, and it's not a hard problem to solve. To have more diversity in newsrooms, to diversify our news coverage, it's not that hard. It's not hard at all.
Well, I hesitated to even bring up that project because I imagine there is a lot of demand for assistance and training in newsrooms. We're certainly seeing it here, especially as we have a new generation of journalists coming in, and talking with people who have done this work for decades and different ideas about how to do it now, and learning from each other, both sides of what we got right, what we got wrong in the past, what we can do better in the future, how we can move this conversation forward, and how to be able to raise your hand to do this work, and feel supported and confident about it. And yeah, we're not there yet, but I'm encouraged that we are moving, that we continue to move in this direction, and there are tools available to help us along the way, and to lean on each other to learn through this time. Just one last shout out for our audience listening along. We are taking questions. If you have a question for Tonya Mosley, please leave it in the chat. We can probably get in 1 or 2 more questions here before we wrap up. Tanya, anything for you? I'm curious, as you've shifted during the pandemic coverage, anything in particular that was a tough adjustment for you, or that really affected your ability to do your job?
As a host, I'm inside most of the time these days, and I'm in front of a mic. But right now, I'm in my closet, and that's where I do the show. This is exactly where I do the show every single day. That was an adjustment, being at home, having 2 children at home while they're also doing school from home, and my husband's also working from home. That was a challenge. And it was even more of a challenge, and it continues to be, knowing the pain and suffering that people are feeling out in the world and wanting to be out there to cover it, to show the humanity of people and, the totality of what's happening. I still don't know if we have a true sense and grasp of just the pain and devastation that COVID-19 has caused. I was a television reporter before I came into radio, and it's one of the things I miss desperately every single day. And, I was a television reporter in Seattle for 7 years. Every single day, I'd go out in the field and cover stories in some part of Western Washington. I know Western Washington like the back of my hand, and I know the people. And it was because of those experiences, when anything big, like something like a pandemic happens, I know where to go when we talk about communities that are impacted the most. The nuances of different communities, I understand that. And so I think that it's important. I think that all journalists who cover local news have had to deal with this. How do you still provide the totality of what's happening to people when you can't be out in the field to do it the way that we used to do it? So I feel that yearning as a journalist, even though I am a host every day in front of a mic, I still have that yearning of being out in the field. And I actually did go out in the field, even in spite of it all, because I just had to be a part of the moment and cover it. And I covered the protests here in Los Angeles as well, the racial justice protests, because I just had to be. I couldn't say I'm sitting in my closet during this moment, you know? I just have to do the best that I can to protect myself with masks and things like that as I'm out there.
Yeah, that sounds similar to adjustments we've made here at KUOW as well, especially during the protests and during the protests during a pandemic, of keeping our journalists in the field safe out there. Um, and I think just in the moment by moment, as things are building up and you're quickly moving, we went from, you know, the PPE gear for our journalists, the masks and the gloves and the sanitizer,
Mhm.
to at one point getting them bulletproof vests out there.
Mm.
It
Oh,
was
wow.
getting very aggressive.
Hmm.
And that was just a reality that we had to confront and move through fairly quickly, but with the constant assessment with our staff of, are we okay? You always have veto power to not be in the field. You can always say, I'm out, I don't feel safe, stay on the sidelines. The sidelines are your friend.
Hmm.
Um, but it's just that quick moving, and that same impulse you're describing as wanting to be there,
Hmm.
bringing the on the ground information to our listeners, being a witness to this
Yep.
moment, and being able to capture the things that you can't get through social media. I mean, you can get a lot, and we rely on social media a lot. That's another, I think, big change we've seen in our newsroom, is that we make those calls about what we need to get in person and what we can rely on other media to partner up with, or which has been great in some ways. We've been able to work with more independent journalists, other smaller organizations, to bring different pieces of the news to us and add to our coverage. So that's been a nice way to kind of fan out and realize that we have limitations, that we can
That's
lean on
right.
other organizations to help out.
Yep.
Let me just double check here if we have any last question I want to get to. Um, Not seeing anything there, but I did want to ask you, I ask a lot of people this during this time. Um, what is one thing that is helping you get through this intense news moment, this pandemic,
Oh,
this
yeah.
once in a lifetime craziness?
Yeah.
Um, I'll tell you, I asked a coworker here recently and she said hula hooping.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, right?
Yeah. I wonder if I can still hula hoop. I haven't done that since I was a kid. Um, I'm doing all the things that I think a lot of people do. I try to spend a lot of time outdoors, reading, really having deep connective conversations with my family members. But what's bringing me the most joy right now is to see the blossoming of my children in a way that when you're moving fast and you're going out to work every day and they're going to school and then you're coming home and you're kind of just sitting down for dinner at the end of the day, it's only on the weekends that you can truly deepen your experiences with them through time. But now we have all the time. I don't know if you all saw, my door opened in the back. I think it was my son who kind of walked in to see. He's 7. Is mom still on the air or not? But what's bringing me joy in particular every morning, I'm set to go live on air for Here and Now, and I hear my son wake up and he's a whistler and he whistles the whole morning. And I think, okay, will you be able to hear that on air? But it's so beautiful that he has a song in his heart. And so it brings hope for me that, like, I need to keep that song in my heart, that passion for making certain that I get the most accurate and truthful information out there for the benefit of our listeners. I know that sounds cheesy, but it really is. Every time I hear him whistle, I think, like, I have to think about what the future is for him and for all the young people, and what my role is in maintaining some sense of a world that is built, that's made for them, that they can exist in and flourish in.
Love that. I love that whistling and that thought
I
of
know.
your children blossoming and watching
Yeah.
the new things that they can take on in this time too, and the creativity and new challenges and resilience, that we can learn from each other and often from our children as well.
Hmm. Yeah.
Tanya, do you know where you're going to be on election night or the day after?
Well, I know I will be on air for Here and Now, and I will be here. I don't know if I will be out in the field yet, but that's also something that you and I didn't talk about, is not just the results of the election, but all of the other scenarios that could play out, and we have to be ready for it. If there will be protests out in the streets, if there will be violence out in the streets, what that looks like, how we will cover it. I'm thinking about all of those things. Where will you be, Liz?
I don't know yet,
Yeah.
but we'll figure that out. There was a moment I thought maybe I will just try to be in Mexico
Oh,
and
really?
check
Yeah.
back in 2 weeks
Oh,
and see. A wild fantasy, Tanya.
I know. Oh, wow. You wouldn't want to miss this time in history,
No,
though. Like, as
no,
a
I wouldn't.
journalist, you got to be there
No,
for it. Yeah.
no way.
But I'll be up late watching everything come in, and what happens and does happen. I'll be there watching.
Well, Tanya, thank you so much. It's really been wonderful speaking with you and seeing you here in my Seattle office.
Yes.
And thank you for your time and for all you're doing with your reporting. And just wanted to say thank you to everyone else who joined us virtually. Wonderful to have you as part of this conversation. If you haven't already, consider registering for our next discussion in this series. On Thursday, September 24th, we'll have NPR's Audie Cornish. She'll sit down virtually with KUOW's Morning Edition host, Angela King. You can register for that event and our other election-related events at KUOW.org or KUOW.org/events, excuse me. I appreciate all of you being here with us tonight. I hope to see you all in person someday soon. But until then, it's good night.
Yes. Thank you, everyone. And I really appreciate this conversation. And I got to sign up to see Audie. That will
Right.
be a good one, too. Yeah, for
And
sure.
Tanya, stay safe with those wildfires. We'll
Thank
be
you. I
thinking about
appreciate
you.
it. Thank you.
All right. All the best to you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.